Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the panel of State Department All-Stars, which included some of my heroes like Ambassador Aponte. So our next panel will focus on how U.S. diplomatic efforts are teaming up with our partners in Europe and Latin America to tackle the climate change challenge and also the related food security challenge. And we know that both of these challenges are sort of the greatest of our generation. And I think it's really great to have a panel of experts who are working both in Washington and in the field to address these issues. So we're going to start with each of the panelists, including myself, sort of doing a quick introduction, just 2 minutes of our background, how we got here, which hopefully you find helpful. And then I have a few questions for the panelists to answer. And then, of course, we'd love to have space and time for members of the audience to jump in with their questions. So beginning with introductions, my name is Eduardo Garcia. I'm currently a special assistant in the Office of the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, so the State Department's senior most official on economics, and he also happens to be the State Department's most senior Latino Hispanic official, Undersecretary Jose Fernandez. So it really is a great honor to be here with all of you. So I'm originally from Houston, Texas, born and raised. Both my parents are Mexican. I went to college in Amherst College, where I was one of the few Latinos, and then also probably one of the few low-income students in college. And it I really got into Latin American history and sort of international affairs. From there, I found out about some international opportunities. I traveled abroad and worked abroad a few years. And then I applied for one of the fellowships to get into the State Department. It's called the Rangel Fellowship. And with that program, the State Department funded my graduate school education, which is always great when you can have somebody pay for your education. And then I joined the Foreign Service after graduate school and have served in Brazil, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan overseas, and then in Washington in our Economic Bureau. And doing economic analysis as well. So next, I'll turn to our panelists, and I'll start with Isabel Riojasca to just give a few minutes about herself.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And thank you first to HECFA for putting this together. When I was a student, I really relished the opportunity to hear from real world practitioners of foreign affairs. And I'm just so glad you're giving students that opportunity today. It's really great. So my current role is I'm the economic counselor here in our U.S. Embassy in Madrid in Spain. And an economic counselor is the ambassador's primary advisor on economic issues between the United States and the country that you're in this case, Spain. And I lead a team of excellent officers that cover every aspect of the economy. And our job is to proactively find ways to partner with Spain to further U.S. interests. And we do that really on the whole host of economic issues. One day it'll be artificial intelligence, another day energy, another day labor, semiconductors, just to name a few. So about me, for me, this tour is actually very special. I grew up here in Spain. My father is Spanish and my mother is American from Arizona. So it feels like a personal and professional milestone to finally be able to, come back to the country of my birth and really bridge that dual heritage in this career and find common ground because of that. Most of my career has been between Washington and Latin America. I've served in the Dominican Republic and Panama, Mexico, Venezuela. I've also served in Washington and the Operations Center, which is a 24-hour office that manages crises around the world. I've also served in the White House. I was North America director in the National Security Council most recently. And then I was also in Tunisia during the Arab Spring. So you see that I've kind of been in a lot of places. But I wanted to make sure I spoke about what inspired me to begin in the Foreign Service. And it really started where you are today when I was a student. I applied and I got an internship in the Office of Cuban Affairs. And that was just a life-changing moment because for the first time I studied international relations and history at the University of Pennsylvania. But, I hadn't really seen the real world application of what I was reading about. And so I got to land in this office, a wonderful internship, and it just opened my eyes to this career and what it could be. That was now 21 years ago. It's kind of crazy to say, but it's been a very exciting ride since. So thank you again, HECFA. Back to you, Eduardo.
Great, thanks. And now we'll have Cristina Fernandez Vaca.
Thank you. I want to echo Isabel's comments, so thank you to HECFA. This is a really, I just feel honored to be able to serve on the panel and kind of give you my perspective that's a little bit different than probably some of the other panelists. I'm currently the Office of Mexican Affairs, Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer. I serve here in Washington, D.C. My parents are Peruvian. They studied in Mexico, had my brother in Mexico, so I have ties to both Peru and Mexico. I spent a lot of time in both. But I actually grew up in Iowa, so not a lot of Hispanic Latinos in Iowa. So that was an interesting place to grow up. I studied at the University of Iowa for environmental engineering. I then did my PhD at Cornell in the same topic. So I am coming from a more scientific engineering background, and I actually came to State through a fellowship, the American Association for the Advancement of Science Technology Policy Fellowship. So it's maybe a non-traditional way to get into State. I didn't really know that much about the department before I joined. So if any of you students feel the same, we're here to kind of help you and give you more information about what we do. But I certainly have, a different background than a lot of the Foreign Service officers. I am a civil servant and expect to stay that way. So I expect to stay in DC. And I try to use, my analytical skills, my research skills that I gained through doing my PhD, through my academic career, to inform policy recommendations. And, I also have technical expertise in a variety of areas. I did my PhD in wastewater treatment, water quality, and greenhouse gas emissions. I also did a little bit of microbiology in there, some applied microbiology. So I have, a very technical background that I try to use, throughout my short career so far here at State. I started in August 2021. So I'm still learning a lot about State, and I really have enjoyed working here. I did the kind of pivot in my career from academia to working at State because I wanted to have kind of a more impact on the world. I see, academia has a very prominent role in kind of informing what we do, but the actual direct impact is kind of lacking, I think, at least for me. So I do kind of enjoy having this more dynamic role where I feel like we as officers get to advise on certain topics, make recommendations, and kind of have that, lights go out when you don't move enough. And have that kind of impact that you don't necessarily feel when you're in academics. So anyway, I'm also very motivated by colleagues here at State, and I hope to continue working here at State. And thank you again for allowing me to join this panel. I'll toss it back to you, Eduardo.
Great, thank you, Christina. And now we'll turn it over to Leonardo Martinez-Diaz.
Thanks so much, Eduardo. My name is Leo Martinez Diaz. I am currently Managing Director for Climate Finance in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry. I was born and raised in Mexico City, and we moved to Chicago when I was 13, and I grew up in the Chicago area for at least until high school and undergrad. Then I did my graduate work in international relations. Like Christina, also got a PhD in international relations and was interested in the academic world. And I have gone back and forth to think tanks and NGOs when I haven't been in government. My time in government has been exclusively as a political appointee. First 7 years of the 8 of the Obama administration, first at USAID, then at Treasury. And then since January 20 in the Biden administration. So since day one, we've been at this. The office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate is a new thing. It was created exclusively in this term, this administration. It is, I think, extremely important because it allows a single senior official to worry about the climate crisis all day, every day. that is different from the past. And I think Secretary Kerry has been, of course, an incredible choice for that position. His leadership, his energy, his commitment to the issue has brought a lot of dynamism to this crisis, and has really come to symbolize just how important the Biden administration holds climate and climate change action. It's also been for me a deep satisfaction and privilege to see how the issues we started working on in the Obama administration on climate have now become mainstreamed across the State Department and across government, really. You look around the federal government today, and you'll see that climate is touching everything and is part of the work of everybody. I saw that very clearly in Treasury. You see it obviously at Department of Energy. You see it in the domestic agenda, which is, I think, historic, and we can talk more about that. And then, of course, in the conduct of our foreign relations, climate is now central to everything, to our geopolitical interests, to our commercial enterprises, and, of course, to our security and development agenda, both in the world, but especially, as we'll talk today, in the Western Hemisphere. So it's a real pleasure for me to work closely with committed and dedicated civil servants, including at the State Department, and I very much hope to continue to do that. Back to you, Eduardo.
Great, thank you so much, Leonardo. I mean, really, it's truly humbling, I think, to be able to work with a really such qualified group of folks, and I think it really shows sort of the diversity of ways that you can come into the State Department, come into international affairs career, whether it's through a technical background, whether it's through foreign service, a political appointee, through one of our academic fellowships. Really just a sort of a diversity of options for coming into the State Department, coming into a foreign affairs career, and working on really, really interesting issues as well. So I think we'll turn next to our questions, and I'll start sort of with sort of a question that's sort of fundamental to what we do as diplomats is, so thinking about culture and context, sort of social issues, as we're working with our partners in Europe, working with our partners in Latin America, who have different worldviews than we do, right? I mean, we all look at challenges in a different way. But as we're looking at sort of this challenge of climate change, challenge of addressing food security across the world, and we're talking with our partners, how do you overcome some of those social, cultural differences and sort of come to a common ground on tackling climate change, on tackling the food security crisis? So I'll start with Isabel first again, and then go to Christina and Leonardo.
Great. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Well, I firmly believe that one of the tenets of diplomacy is empathy. We're in a people business. So, in any situation, whether you're negotiating an agreement, whether you're, gathering information, putting forward a new idea, you need to know where that other person is coming from. And I have found this true in any context, anywhere in the world. But it's really no different on the climate crisis. It impacts us all, but it does so in different ways, right? We have different constraints, different considerations. I'm sure Leo works on this a lot from his perch, but, some countries, the constraint may be access to finance. It's not political will, but they don't have the funding to make the investments that they need to green their energy sector, for example. For other countries, maybe there's domestic industry or regulatory challenges. For others, maybe there's political calculations that affect climate decisions. So really, you have to pare it back. And the most important thing you have to do is put yourself at that other side of the table. What does this issue look like to that country and to that interlocutor? How do they see us? What are they perceiving about the United States? And then, really asking, doing some critical thinking and saying, well, why does the status quo exist? What brought us here? So once you understand those things, you can then get to the what to do about it. How do I bridge that difference? I've found that in Latin America and in Spain, that drawing on the Spanish language really helps. Communication and trust is a huge piece of this. So if you're able to communicate and meet your interlocutors in their language, that's really helpful. Here in Spain, I just want to speak briefly on the climate agenda here. We are working with a great partner. It's really a government that prioritizes climate transition as a key goal. So our starting point is already seeing this as an existential threat. So then we say, okay, well, what can we do together? How do we get the rest of the world on this boat with us, right? So we have, COP28, big global climate meeting next month, and we're talking to Spain about how do we work together to have more renewable energy or dissuade countries from making new investments in coal or unabated coal. And these are the types of things. So we will go to Spain and we will connect the right Spanish partners with the experts in the United States and do that mediation so that they can kind of coordinate on that. But that's not all we do. We don't just talk to governments. We talk to companies. For example, energy companies in Spain are really at the forefront. You might have heard, right? They're big in wind and solar and renewables. So how do they see the picture? We also talk to companies that have nothing to do with energy, but for example, like a chemical company or transport and logistics, because they all have plans to green and decarbonize. So what are they saying? Finally, I just want to highlight, as U.S. diplomats, we don't only focus on the country where we're stationed. We also tell the story of the United States. So on the climate crisis, we have a very good story to tell. We are walking the walk on this. We need to share the expertise that we've developed. And, for example, we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, things that we're doing in the states where you're living, right? That show that we're concerned about this and we're part of the global solution. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Eduardo.
Great, thank you so much. I think putting yourself in the shoes of your counterparts is really important. Sometimes those shoes don't fit, and then you sort of have to figure out what do you do. So I think next we'll turn to Christina to hear her perspective.
Sure. Well, I absolutely echo everything Isabel said. So I work on Mexico, and I will say, there are differences by administration on who's prioritizing climate change. Of course, our administration here in the U.S. is prioritizing it, as Isabel said, with the IRA, with the BIL. We're really putting resources where we're talking about these issues, right? In other countries, it might not be their priority. They might be less amenable to talking about climate change, to kind of implementing mitigation strategies. So it can be challenging working in a country that is not prioritizing this, that has challenges with energy, with investing in renewable energies and implementation. So kind of what Isabel said, I think, our role as diplomats is just to have continued engagement. And I think, in areas where maybe our interagency partners think, this issue is intractable, we're not making progress, they can kind of lose hope. We are there to say, no, we'll continue raising this. We're going to continue engaging on this. And Leonardo's probably going to talk about Special Envoy Kerry's engagement. But he is really kind of the perfect example. He has gone to Mexico, I think it's 7 or 8 times, Leonardo can correct me, to engage on this issue, to keep raising, climate change is an existential crisis. We need to be doing something about this. We need to raise our ambitions. What can we do together to help Mexico meet those climate commitments that they have put forth? So I think, kind of continuing that engagement when we see, maybe even when we don't see progress, is incredibly important and kind of our role here at State.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. Leonardo, welcome your insight.
Thank you. I'd say 2 things. The first is, in order to have a credible and effective diplomacy on climate, we have to do our work at home. If we can't deliver at home on our commitments as the largest economy in the world, the second largest emitter, the largest historical emitter, folks will just not take us seriously. It's very difficult to demand more ambition from others if we are not willing to implement it ourselves. And so that is why domestic policy and how we talk about climate in the United States really matters. And that's why this administration has made it so essential to put climate on the agenda internationally, but also domestically. And for us, when we do big things on climate at home, it really puts wind in our sails abroad. It really allows us to gain credibility both with our partners in Europe, who are also have been traditionally leaders on climate. It allows us to ask for more ambition from developing countries, including many in the hemisphere. And importantly, it allows us to help also put pressure on China, now the largest global emitter, to also do what's needful in China. And so for us, the key steps, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, as Christina mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law, a whole series of rules and regulations involving how do we green our economy, how do we improve our energy efficiency, how do we deploy electric vehicles, all those things are giving us the credibility we need. And they're also, by the way, helping us develop the technologies and the products that are going to be very helpful for the rest of the world to help meet their commitments and their goals. Then the second thing is, I think to your point, Eduardo, is we have to listen very, very carefully to how different countries approach climate, because the reality is that climate change, the climate crisis, is affecting different groups and different countries in very different ways. So just taking a look as an example at the Western Hemisphere, we have, for example, the Caribbean, where you have some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world who are extremely worried about the impacts of climate on their future, on their economies, their communities. And they also, by the way, have very decentralized energy systems. They are net oil importers. And so they're worried about their energy security as well. And so we need to meet them where they are. And we need to be able to talk to them about their priorities. In the larger economies, Brazil, Mexico, they see already the impacts of their communities as well, their economies. But they're also major producers of fossil fuel energy. And so we have to engage them. And one of the reasons Secretary Kerry has been going to Mexico very often is to try to break through this idea that there is a zero-sum conflict between climate and energy security, when that is the kind of thinking that we have moved on from. Luckily, thanks to new technologies and the falling cost of renewables, we can actually offer countries good alternatives that are cost effective and that preclude the need to continue to dig up fossil fuels that will have a very, very high cost. And in Brazil, of course, and all the other countries that surround the Amazon, there's now a very deep understanding that there's a need to protect the Amazon as a major carbon sink, and of course, a huge repository of ecosystems and natural wealth. And that's why we have, now that the Lula government is in power in Brazil, we're very keen to have conversations with them about how we can help to protect the Amazon. And then, of course, there's many other countries around the region who are somewhere in between, have fossil fuel wealth they're trying to figure out what to do with. They have, of course, vulnerable communities that are trying to protect themselves. And so we have to be able to listen with that level of subtlety and refinement as to what it is that they are looking for and how we can help advance that. On November 3rd, you will see that the APEP, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity Summit, will take place in the White House, and climate will be an important part of that. It's also been an important part of the U.S.-Caribbean partnership to address the climate crisis, which Vice President Harris has led. And so climate is now baked into almost every major engagement in the region. Finally, I'd say and I would highlight the importance of personal diplomacy. During COVID, I think we all got used to Zoom diplomacy, and that was helpful during those times, and it certainly was better than doing nothing. But certainly, Special Envoy Kerry believes strongly in personal diplomacy. There's no real substitute for being there and forming those human bonds with our counterparts abroad. And that, of course, is a core part of our diplomacy. We have to be able to continue that. And that's why the negotiations that will take place at the United Arab Emirates in December are going to be so important. It's the place where we meet face to face to try to work out the most thorny elements of this question.
Thank you so much, Leonardo. I mean, I think it's super interesting thinking about the way that Special Envoy Kerry, how much he travels to the region, how much he's interacting face to face, and our, as diplomats, international affairs professionals, our job is to sort of give that historical, political, environmental, social context, and the more diverse backgrounds that we have, whether it's scientific, from law, from social sciences. I think the more diverse backgrounds we have at the State Department, I think it helps us better inform our leadership, and sort of help guide them in these conversations with foreign counterparts. So thank you so much. I'll turn to the next question, and sort of just for the Western Hemisphere in particular, sort of a key stakeholder that we think about is indigenous groups, both in sort of throughout Latin America, also in the United States and Canada, and thinking about how we engage with indigenous groups. How do we take into account their perspectives when we're engaging in diplomatic efforts to counter climate change and again address sort of the food security sort of crisis? So maybe I'll start. I can start with Leonardo, and then maybe we'll go Isabel and Christina.
Sure. I think this is a very important group in the conversations about climate for a couple of reasons. One is that indigenous peoples in many countries, including ours, by the way, are often marginalized from conversations about climate solutions, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And they absolutely have to be part of those conversations, partly because they're affected directly by the solutions, and also because they tend to be disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change based on where they live, and the types of wealth and infrastructure that exists to protect them from climate impacts. And so they have to be at the table. The other reason it's really important that they be at the table is because they often have deep knowledge and understanding of the ecosystems and the natural world in their particular communities, one that frankly goes back longer than European colonization in this continent, and therefore can harbor a lot of useful and important insights. Many groups have had a long and harmonious relationship with the natural world, or at least a more balanced and equilibrated one. And we need to be able to understand that perspective so that we can have better solutions. The challenge is how to engage them effectively. And that means that our international development assistance, for example, our posts in country, our engagement through public diplomacy has to be customized to be able to reach those groups. Oftentimes there's linguistic barriers, there's geographical barriers. Sometimes going through the central government can be tricky. And so in all those cases, we need to figure out more effective ways to engage them, and to try to do our best to persuade the central governments to include those communities in their own conversations about domestic policy. And that's obviously tricky and has to be done with great sensitivity, but it is also quite important. And finally, a lead by example, right? We have now in the United States, for example, a committee that includes tribal and indigenous leaders in the discussion of adaptation and resilience. And so we have to show that in the United States, we're also doing our best to include those communities in the conversation.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I will turn Isabel next.
Thank you, Eduardo. I maybe want to take a little bit of a different take than what Leo said and just zoom the question out to talk about kind of second order effects and making sure you're not just looking at an issue too literally, right? So, climate change, we all know at this point, it's not about the weather, it's about so many other different things, right? But it's really important that we talk to as many people as possible and all, get a lot of different perspectives. So I want to speak to an example from Panama. I know you heard from Ambassador Aponte, who's a friend, and I served in Panama recently, so it's close to my heart. But, even a few years ago when I served there, we knew that the Panama Canal was being impacted by climate change. And the Panama Canal is a major artery for world trade. I mean, what you ate this morning on your plate and the thing you order from Amazon, there are high chances that came through the Panama Canal. So, if you know, the canal connects the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, and in between there's a lake, Lago Gatun. And the water levels of that lake are completely impacted by climate change. And the water levels dictate what kinds of ships and how frequently they can go through. So this has like a real today impact, right? And it's important that we talk to the people managing that, and not only to understand what is their plan for the canal, but to also understand that their role in the shipping industry is really outsized. So what we did back then is, we made sure we're talking to the Panama Canal Authority, to the users of the canal, and really working with them to make sure that they were and they do have a plan to green the shipping industry and kind of use their privileged position to make an impact in that industry. So, I guess similar to the question, what I'm getting at is you have to think about every issue creatively and say, okay, where can I, how do I eat the elephant? This is such a big, hard problem. Well, the answer is, one bite at a time. And so you take the piece that you can work on and the piece that you can fix. And, before finishing, I just want to make a pitch to you all. Working in the Foreign Service and the government is gratifying precisely for this reason. These are really hard problems, and we need the best of the best. We need people like you with your preparation, with your point of view, because we're not going to solve this with just one type of thinking or the things we've done in the past. We need fresh ideas and fresh thinking to be able to look at these really complex issues. For me, this career has been so gratifying because you are part of something bigger. You're part of something bigger than yourself, and you're really making an impact. So I hope that you all consider using your experience and putting it toward government work and diplomacy if you can. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Isabel. And now we'll turn to Christina.
Yeah, I'll be brief, but I do think, our U.S. embassies in the region definitely do a lot of the groundwork and a lot of legwork with connecting with Indigenous communities, and really getting their input, their buy-in, and they do a lot of the work, and they realize, the importance of Indigenous communities and bringing them to the table, as Leonardo said. They're going to play an outsized role in how we can do renewable energy implementation. A lot of times in a lot of countries in the regions, and Indigenous communities own the land that they live on. So, how is that land going to be used? What works for these communities? What are their goals? Understanding all of this, and then also getting, the green light from them if we can implement these new renewable technologies in their communities. So I think, a lot of that kind of communication really comes down to our embassies. So, our Foreign Service officers are amazing. They are constantly out talking to the communities that they are working with. And I think, that's a really important role for them. I also want to highlight that the department has the Science Envoy program, which essentially is bringing U.S. scientists and engineers and their expertise to kind of find new ways to collaborate internationally on different challenges. But one of our envoys that started last year is Kyle White. He's a professor in environmental justice at the University of Michigan, and he works specifically on, his research focuses on Indigenous peoples' rights, knowledge in climate change and conservation planning. So he is, really specific and targeted to kind of addressing these challenges, not just in the region, but more broadly. So I think, the State Department does a really good job of trying to reach these communities and bringing in the expertise to kind of address these challenges.
Great, thank you so much. I think I think we'll go to some of the questions from the audience. We do have a few questions next. And the question from Bryson, how can someone go about acquiring an internship with an office such as Office of Cuban Affairs or Andean Affairs? And please share how you applied your internships. And so, Bryson, I think you can explore more on the Foreign Service internships at careers.state.gov. But maybe what would be interesting if maybe Christina, can you elaborate a little bit more? Because I think your AAA fellowship, not an internship, it's a fellowship for PhDs. But maybe can you describe a little bit more about a AAAS fellowship and sort of how you found it, and then what you've gained from it at the department?
Yeah. Yeah, so certainly the AAAS Fellowship is one of many fellowships and internship opportunities to kind of get your foot in the door at state. I do highly recommend if you do want to be at state to apply to an internship. We have had amazing fellows in our office. And we really use them well. We put them to task. We have them working on paper and supporting meetings. So highly encourage you, as Eduardo said, to look on careers.state.gov, and USA Jobs, I think, also post some internships. For me, the fellowship, for the AAAS Fellowship, was something that I heard about kind of through my networks. So when people say networking is important, they are right. You kind of hear about these things, right? And then I did my own research on what does this entail. So the AAAS Fellowship, one of the agencies that you can kind of apply to is state, among a lot of other agencies. But kind of coming into it with a little bit of a different background. I again have a very technical background, but I do have, these other skills that I think you can highlight when you're applying to internships. If you don't necessarily have the exact background that they might be looking for, you can highlight different skills. For me, that was, being able to communicate science in an easier to understand way, comfort with presenting, briefing, things like this are really important, particularly at State Department. You will be constantly briefing people, and it will be at the drop of a hat. So if you have good communication skills, if you're a good writer, speaker, all these things, they're incredibly important, and something that I would absolutely highlight in your internship, as well as any government service that you have previously had. For my fellowship, I highlighted, I served in AmeriCorps back post undergrad. And I had worked in city government before. So, kind of highlighting any of those links that you have to serving in your community or in your country, I think is really important. And hopefully you will have success for applying to these internships. I really recommend them.
Great, thanks so much. We had one more question from the audience, from Remy. And the question is, what are the biggest steps of progress you've seen on this issue diplomatically in the last few years? And what progress do you hope to see in the coming years? And I think sort of related to one of the last questions is sort of, what have you enjoyed working on the most? So maybe a combination of, what are the biggest progress you've seen? What do you hope to see? And then what have you enjoyed working on the most? And we'll turn it over to Leonardo first.
Sure. In the climate space, obviously the Paris Agreement in 2016 was crucial. And before that, we did not have an agreed global framework for tackling the crisis. There have been a number of efforts, most prominently the Kyoto Protocol, and those didn't work. They ultimately did not find a consensus globally. And so the Paris Agreement is sort of that milestone, that cornerstone of our efforts. And it has obviously a lot of mechanisms to help coordinate global action, but it's only as good as the individual commitments of each country. And that's why it's so important to help increase ambition at the country level, including the United States and the other major emitters, as well as developing countries that will become important emitters in the future. And so for us, that's the next big step, is how do we do that? The treatment of fossil fuels in diplomacy is really important as well. Back in Glasgow, so 2 years ago, we finally secured language where countries agreed to phase down the use of fossil fuels, and that was extremely important. And the question now is, how do you actually implement that? So there's always an iterative relationship between, on one hand, the diplomacy and what countries are willing to agree to and accept, and on the other hand, the technology and the costs of energy and the domestic politics that increasingly are favoring decisive action on climate. And so we're seeing how the diplomacy has evolved over the last 8 years in a way that is increasingly more ambitious. And that's made possible in part because there's more finance, there's better technology, there's cheaper solar and wind, and there's more and more young people in every country that are demanding that their leaders do more. And so there's that important relationship between the domestic and the international, I think we have to keep in mind. And it's something that's going to, I think, transform the climate conversation in the next decade.
Great, thanks so much. Christina, is there anything in particular that you've really enjoyed, sort of a highlight from your time at States, or that you've that has really stood out to you, and then also maybe something that you're hopeful for?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so many things. I will say State is an exciting place to work, but it can be also very stressful. But I have, been able to join Secretary Kerry in a meeting with Foreign Secretary of Mexico, and like, to me, it's like, wow, this is incredible seeing, how he communicates what our priorities are, how he engages on this issue, how he raises climate change, and it's not just a kind of like, here's what we want you to do conversation, right? It's a discussion. It's, what do you need? What do you see as the goals for your country? What are the challenges? Where can we be helpful? So really seeing that kind of high level conversation as just a bystander, I wasn't participating, but it was really impactful. I think seeing how diplomacy is done at that level is different than what I do on a day-to-day basis, but it helps inform how I do my work, how I can best prepare principals, prepare our leadership for meetings. I think to me that was probably the most exciting thing that I've done while at State, and that was very recent. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to join that meeting. In terms of what I am hopeful for, I guess I just want to continue working at State, and being able to kind of help push the ball forward on climate change and these really challenging issues that we work on every day. Seeing any positive movement, like Leonardo was saying, making the commitment is one thing, actually doing the action is another. So we're able to oftentimes get the verbal commitment, and then the actual action that happens is a little bit slower. So seeing any progress in that realm, I think, to me would be very exciting. And that's what I'm certainly hoping for.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I think we're sort of at sort of time with the panel. So first, I just really want to thank Christina. I really want to thank Leo for joining us. Isabel has dropped off a little earlier, but really, I think if you get anything from this panel, know that we have some really talented folks from diverse backgrounds who bring all sorts of skills and experiences and knowledge, again, whether it's technical, whether it's scientific, whether it's historical, social, legal. So we have those folks in the State Department, but the challenges that we have, again, whether it's climate change or food crises or anything else going on in the world, are so huge that we need infinitely more talented people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds who can really help us, help our leadership think about hard questions, tackle those hard questions, and then implement, right, make things happen. So I think really welcome everyone's interest in joining the State Department, joining the foreign affairs community within the U.S. government and sort of internationally. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for those who asked questions, and thank you again for the panel for joining us. And last, thank you for HECFA. Thank you to HECFA, of course, for hosting us, and our colleagues from GTN. So thank you again.